So this is the first of 3 videos on motor learning. And in this video, we're going to look at the learning experience, and we're going to start to understand the process of providing instructions and demonstrations to clients. The other 2 videos will look at the teaching aspect, and then the last one will look at this feedback and practice. This map is going to serve as an overall view of our what we're looking at with motor behavior. And as we see, this makes up 3 areas of motor control, motor learning, and motor development. The motor control we're not really affecting so much. I mean, you are improving as the client gets stronger. Same thing with the motor development. And so what we're really looking here is this motor learning, which is the acquisition of these motor skills and this transfers of information that comes from you, the coach, to the receiving end of the client. This next slide is, there's a lot going on here. And this is one of my favorite slides because this image on the right really shows the human movement system and the pathways in which we can intervene as experts. Whether we're trying to restore function or improve performance, we have different tiers. And the way to really look at the purpose of this slide is really looking at this technique versus ability. And it is to appreciate the fact that when you start working with clients, that you are trying to transfer knowledge, technical information, blueprints, if you will, to your client, and they in turn have to process that and then perform on and execute those tasks. And so this movement that we see here at the bottom, and we're looking at all the resources that are required, the neuromuscular and musculoskeletal resources, and we're looking at these arrows here, and this is the communication that happens between and the feedback that's going back. And there's this knowledge or the blueprint of what's happening in order for this movement to occur, but they must have the neuromuscular and musculoskeletal resources to be able to perform that. And so we look at this like internal process, this software type component. These things change with practice, and these things can change pretty quickly. It's not hard to understand what you have to do, but then you're dealing with the ability, the actual resources. Do they have the hardware to do that? And these are relatively stable. These changes occur over a 6 to 8 week period. So you can see improvement in performance typically related to neurological inputs, but you do get tissue adaptation over time. But again, every 6 to 8 weeks, the body is changing, thus the client's going to be able to do more and more. So just keep that in mind, that you can be telling and trying to coach and cue and all the things here, and they might know what they need to do, but they might not have the ability to do it. And we'll talk more about this in a later slide. So there's 3 types of intervention that you can do from a coaching perspective. You can provide verbal communication to make changes, both internal and external. You can provide visual stimuli, both internal and external, and you have some level of proprioceptive or tactile inputs that you can do. The majority of this lecture is coming out of this textbook called The Language of Coaching by Nick Winkelman, and it's a phenomenal book. It's relatively new in the last year. I think it was published in April of 2020, and this video is being recorded in September of 2020, and this lecture was created over a year ago. And so if you want more information, more in-depth aspect, this textbook is phenomenal. Verbal cues are by far the most common and one of the most researched coaching cues. External cues, these focus on how the body's output affects the environment, so like outcomes and objects. And internal cues focuses on the body processes and internal systems like muscles and pressure and so forth. So if you look at the image on the left here, you'll see the text there is the type of communication you would say, like pull the kettleboard towards the ceiling or push the ground away. So you're providing inputs to the client, but they are now turning their focus into the external environment, so the kettlebell or the ground. Whereas on the right side, you're looking at these internal verbal cues. Communication's the same. Outcomes are probably the same. The movement is the same, but instead of having the client focus on the external environment, you're having the client focus on the internal environment. And as we'll talk about, there's different advantages and disadvantages to directing your clients of focus to external versus internal. The most important aspect of external cueing is incorporating part of the existing environment, so the immediate environment. External cues can have some relation to description of motion, the direction of movement, or the distance and location. Simply choose something that is not connected to the person. So don't reference muscles, hands, joints, feet. It can be anything from a belt buckle to a location in the room. Analogies also fall into this external cueing category, and don't overcomplicate things with too many words. Keep it simple, stupid, or KISS. So here's the anatomy of the external cues, and it's going to be broken down from distance, direction, description, not necessarily in this order, but those are the three things that make up the external cue. Examples for distance are going to be close and far, as you can see on the screen there. For direction, which way do you move toward an intended target or object? So forward, back, right, left, up, down. The distance is the length or horizontal displacement required to reach an intended target. So like take a long step forward to the front of the room, move until you reach the first cone. So kind of giving not necessarily exact like 12 feet or 15 steps, but proximity to other aspects. And the description is the one that's probably the most, not confusing, but it's not as straightforward. This is the use of like active verbs or analogies to provide imagery of the intended movement. So as you squat, turn your feet out like they are wiping the floor out to the side. Feet are mentioned. Remember, that's part of the internal aspect, but the focus the client is doing is on the floor itself. Words also that fall in this category in the description are like explode, push, drive, rotate. So some kind of verb or action that's correlated with the exercise or movement itself. So we'll take this cue here, focus on snapping the bar towards the ceiling. And you have the description, right? So snapping, that's the action verb. So snap or quick or thrust. You have the direction toward, and see how it's not like a specific thing. And then the ceiling, that's the distance, right? Whatever the distance is from you to you didn't get a tape measure out and measure it, but you're giving the client some external focus on what to do. And so you kind of see how that external cue has the distance, the direction, description. Again, not in that specific order, but all the elements are there. So here's a few examples for the external cues using description, direction, and distance. So in that first one, bench press, drive the bar toward the ceiling. That was similar to the one we just saw. In the squat, from case number 3, squat down as if you hover above a chair just behind you. So you look through these, you can see that they're using real world examples, and they're not saying anything about joints or muscles or body parts. It's all about what you want to do with that external load, where you're pushing it, right? So these are external cues. Then we move to internal verbal cues, and these are a lot different. If you look at here at some of these previous external cues, you can see that they use these really powerful and explosive and load and drive and accelerate, right? These big, like aggressive type movements, which you want to do, right? You're trying to generate muscle force and transfer that to a load. When you get into these internal verbal cues, you'll see that these are more about mindfulness and awareness and bringing attention to different parts of the body. With internal cueing, we're not talking about performance or even motor learning. We're talking about really this body awareness and ultimately this control. You can only control what you feel. And if you can't intrinsically feel a part of your body, that can be a problem in the learning process. This is challenging for many people. We sometimes call them motor morons when they first start. It's it's not infinitely, but it is easier to focus on an object instead of the body. You start external when you start working with people, but you build awareness over time. The end goal for these internal cues are so they can self-correct. So the external cues have historically been shown to be more effective, like scientifically, and studies have shown this. And it is easy. When you start working with people, it's much easier to get someone to focus on an external object than it is to try to control their body. And we'll use an example about pelvic control, being able to teach someone how to do an anterior, posterior pelvic tilt, or trying to get their back in a specific position. Most people have no idea, but if you put them on a ball and say, roll the ball backwards, they inherently know which way the ball needs to go, and then roll the ball forward, they can tuck it under. And so you'll find this over and over again. But it doesn't mean that external cues are better than internal cues. It just means that external cues are the start, and you eventually progress to the internal cues. Because ultimately, your goal is to get people to be able to do things on their own without your input, so they become more independent. And the only way that can happen is if they become aware of what's happening within their body. And so you start external and you progress to internal. And it's not so much like external to internal, but you still want to make a differentiation between external cues versus internal cues. So when we look at an example like this, where we see the image on the left is the knees diving in, and that's showing collapse with gravity, and the one on the right is the one you want to achieve. So you observe a problem, so the image on the left, and you see the one on the right, and so your goal is to try to communicate that. So you could tell one strategy is to Knees out, right? That's the example that you want. So you could just tell them to turn your knees out. You can tighten your stomach and stabilize the core, which would all be examples of internal cues. But once you tell someone to tighten their stomach, if they haven't gone through that process, so they don't really know what that means, that's not going to make sense to them. You could give them an external cue and give them focus instead of their knees. You can get the same exact result of the knees out, but you could tell them to spread the floor. So try to spread the floor with your feet and you'll get the similar outcome. And that might be a lot easier for a client to grab first time through instead of like trying to figure out what do I need to do with my knees. So you can look through here the internal versus external cues, and you can see when they're ever talking about a body part, a joint or a muscle that's internal, you're taking the person from outside and in, or if you have them focus on the weight, the load, or the outcome, that's external. And like I said, it's usually easier for people, especially beginners, to start externally, and then you coach them over time into this internal aspect. So the next tier of cues are visual cues, and these tend to be the next largest aspect. They are rarely discussed in the coaching realm. They're not used often. However, there are some very interesting concepts in this category that ultimately can have a huge impact on your client's movements. It's easier to start with the external cues. These are influences. These things influence movement through like visual input. So what they see, using a mirror so they can get some feedback, targets, taking recordings of your clients so you kind of use as a coaching aspect. Then it gets into this realm of like the internal cue, which is part of actually a learning process, but this mental rehearsal of the movement or mental practices. So there's quite a bit of things that can happen in the internal component. The two biggest things that you'll do with the external environment is simply change something in the environment that the person can see. So either creating some kind of barrier or creating a target. In this case, you'll see them in this, like trying to pick up, like say a deadlift or a kettlebell swing. Instead of letting the knees go forward, you're trying to cue the hips to go back and just giving them a target that they can see and see how he's looking in the mirror so that he has some feedback, visual input of where his hips are in space. The internal cueing, this is more the body mapping and building self-awareness. This is a lot of thinking about the movement and then connecting with the visual feedback. This is a lot of the mirror use, but again, it's to connect with what they're doing, what they're feeling with what they're seeing, and then see if they can reproduce this on their own without actually performing the task. And there's quite a bit of evidence that looking at mental practice can be as effective as actual physical practice, that the connections being made are the important aspect. Then we get into the proprioceptive cues, and the proprioceptive cues are part of the tactile cueing that we talked about in the last lecture. This proprioceptive cues are very common in both rehab and training. It's a common sense type of approach that can have more profound effects than any other sensory change. In fact, proprioceptive therapies where you're looking at motor control versus actual tissue stuff, but you can make some pretty significant changes. These proprioceptive cues can be divided into many different subcategories, and we break them up in the next slide. But a proprioceptive cue, by altering the posture and changing sensory input for the lower extremity, like in this image you see here from left to right, the kneeling position, what you've done is you've changed the proprioceptive environment. You've taken a more complex task and reduced it by taking two of the joint segments out, the foot and the ankle, and now loading through the knee. So you can manipulate the exercise by making it more challenging, or by making it more difficult, or by changing it up by making small changes to the proprioceptive demands, and this can then change the learning process. In the proprioceptive aspect, we have tactile cueing, and we had that whole art of cueing lecture where we introduced to the cueing aspect, but we really got into the touch, how you touch people to stimulate and to modify behavior. You can modify the type or mode of exercise. Having different forms of the exercise can create novelty in the movement and help the client connect with the task. So you're altering, and the change can be like radically changing the exercise, like going from a standing dumbbell press to a seated cable row, or you can slightly modify it to give a slight different sensory input, like going from barbells to dumbbells for the same movement, or just changing the plane a little bit to create a different stimuli. When we look at the third thing on the list, that motor chunking, it's basically taking complex tasks and breaking them down into simpler tasks, or taking simple tasks and trying to break them into the smallest component. So you're basically, what you're doing is you're rehearsing certain elements of the move, and then you're breaking it back in. And then the last thing, the resistance, putting load, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, that trying to do a bench press or a squat without load sometimes can be difficult. And having that pressure feedback, that proprioceptive feedback from the loading, or compressing the joints where you're relatively closing the chain, this can stimulate the joint mechanoreceptors and increase the muscle participation. So sometimes adding a little bit of resistance can help in the learning process. Okay, so when you're putting all this into practice, you have a lot of different types of cues. You can do external, internal, verbal, external, internal, visual, and then you have a whole set of proprioceptive aspects to you. In the end, you want to keep it as simple as possible. You want the client to do the work, and you just want to provide just enough for them to get it, right? And you can't rush it. It's a learning process they have to go through their own, and you don't want to deny them the experience of learning on their own. So you're a guide, you're a coach, but you want to give the minimal amount of input for your maximum amount of results. The understanding the difference between offering an external verbal cue and internal verbal cue, and how you would combine this with this proprioceptive cue and mental imagery, you can see how this can get more complex. But that understanding of how they all come together can, you start to become more of a master of your craft. So you're never just giving an external verbal cue. You might just give an external verbal cue, but in order to the learning process, you might combine this with some kind of touching and then some kind of mental imagery afterwards, and you might rotate the different types of cues in and out. You might have a client that is just not getting anywhere, and you need to abandon ship and start with plan B and then go on to plan C and all the way down to plan Z. Hopefully you don't make it to plan Z. Ultimately, there are no standard cues, and so spend time learning cues from other people and coaches. A quick internet search of squatting cues will give you hours of reading material, but there are a lot of sources out there for the cues, and you eventually want to build your library. And number 3 here is kind of an important aspect, and we talk more about it in learning and the teaching videos, but how you talk to a beginner is going to be much different than how you talk to an expert. The beginner is already at capacity mentally, so you have to move slow, and 1 or 2 things might take you 1 or 2 sessions to change. Where an expert, 1 or 2 things might be changed in 1 or 2 reps. So you definitely have to keep aware of this. And in the end, the more practice you have at it, and that you'll gain more experience, the more natural it becomes, and you'll be able to see things and cue things out. You'll have your own library. You'll have a certain set of go-to things, and you'll start to see patterns of, yes, most people have trouble with this, and then you'll be able to preemptively solve those problems. And so it all comes together with time and practice. So before you start having a client or teach a client any movements, these are the 4 things you want to look at. Is, again, what's the training experience? Number 2, is this a new movement or just a refinement of a new one? Number 3, how many joints are involved, right? Is it a single joint exercise, or is it like a push or a pull? And then the last one, what's the goal? Right? Are you in the learning phase? Is this just to build awareness? Are you trying to restore something? Is this general exercise? So all of these things come into play before you start teaching the movement. So then you have the 2 questions after the movement. Pretty straightforward. Did it look good? Right? So was there something that needed to change? And then this process of internal aspect, where did they feel it? This is the process that continues over and over again. Did it look good? Yes, you leave it alone. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Does it need intervention? Yes. And then you go through the process. And that's the next lecture, Motor Learning 2, where we get into that teaching, coaching aspect. In the end, you now have been introduced to your types of cues. You have your differentiation between external, internal, and then the verbal, tactile, and visual. And next lecture, we'll look at what do we actually do and how do we actually do it.